So supposedly that was the last steam passenger train, well, that was the last steam train on the Northern Pacific out here. The Northern Pacific steamed up 1070 and it headed down to McCleary. And Vance Collier down there in Olympia remembers hearing you go by his house, which is quite surprising because everybody knew that the steam engines had been off the lines for months, and all of a sudden this thing comes whistling by McCleary, heading out to McCleary. We bought it at McCleary from Simpson. Simpson leased it from the Northern Pacific. Then the Northern Pacific decided, well, if you want it, you better buy it. And so they bought it. And a few months later, their diesel came, and so they just parked it there. That's when Bruce Fowler and I found it. And then the glass company I mentioned before bought it, and then they paid the Northern Pacific to tow it back up to Seattle, at their Northwestern Glass Company on Marginal Way. Well, now I have the steam engine, what am I going to do with it? So I didn't have any idea at the time, but then I had heard that the Strasburg Railroad was actually hauling passengers someplace or other on a little 4-mile stretch of track out there in Pennsylvania. And at that time I couldn't figure out why anybody would get on a train unless they wanted to go somewhere, so why are you going to go back and forth on 4 miles of track? But obviously the Strasburg was doing it, so I said, well, maybe I'll try to get something like this going sometime. Well, anyway, I had 1070. Well, then the next thing was we needed some passenger cars. So at that time, Louis Menck had come over to the Northern Pacific from the Burlington, and I knew he was kind of like to streamline everything and get rid of anything that didn't seem too useful. And so when I found out he was going to South Tacoma, I got a hold of my friend Ed Bernstein down there and said, he's coming through the shop one of these days, and he's probably going to see these passenger cars sitting there. They had been used, well, I'm going to back up a little bit here. They were kind of standby cars on the Northern Pacific for quite a while. On Christmas Eve of 1964, the Main Streeter leaving town, number 2, the only cars on it, other than the baggage cars, were a slumber coach and 4 of these cars. And I think the general manager saw that people were flying around in 707s at that time, jet airplanes, and here the Northern Pacific was coming up with this train with 4 1910 vintage passenger cars as the only coaches on the train, plus the slumber coach and the baggage cars. And so they decided to retire them except they used them for excursions for about one more year, and then that was the end of that, about 1965, and shortly thereafter, Mr. Mink comes around through the South Tacoma shop and says, get rid of them. Ed Bernston calls me up. I wasn't working in St. Paul at the time. He calls me up on a Friday saying, if you want to buy them, you have to have cash into the store department on Monday. So I said, well, how much do they want for them? So we went down and talked to the shop superintendent, I guess, I think that's who it was, somebody down there. And they said, well, they've been going for around $1,800. So I said to Ed, make them an offer of $1,835. There were two more, or three more. One, the railroad wanted to keep as an outfit car, and they'd already taken all the seats out of it. The second two had some seats removed because the Snoqualmie people wanted spare coach seats for their X46 or whatever car they had, an old 1883 car that didn't have seats in it when they got it. So these were the two cars that were intact, and so we got them, and then we took them up to the Snoqualmie Railroad for a while, and they used them on Christmas trains until we were ready to start the Lake Whatcom Railway in 1972. Some of the people at Snoqualmie did not want that engine at all. They didn't want it up there or anything, so they built the track in such a way that we couldn't run it there. The ties were too far apart, and the rail was too small, or various things like that. So we never ran it until we actually got it up to Lake Whatcom again. Ran it at the glass company. We stored it at Snoqualmie for a number of years, and they did use the passenger cars, but remember the passenger cars, the axle loading is just about half of what it is on the steam engine. Then we started it in 1972 up here. And maybe I was really confident in myself because we were selling tickets and sending out brochures when all these train things were still at Snoqualmie, and we were out, and people would say up here, you're selling tickets for a train on June 3rd, and we don't see any equipment here except a handcar. But anyway, June 3rd, 1972 is when we started up. I decided I wanted to go into business for myself, so I left the Burlington Northern and started the Lake Whatcom Railway. We incorporated in 1970, just before the merger, a couple of months before the merger, when it looked like that was going to happen. I wrote a letter to Mr. Mank, who was the president I mentioned before at the time, and so he responded and said, we'll consider it and let you know in due course, or something to that effect. And a year and a half later, they sold the Lake Whatcom Railway, the first 4 miles of the Billingham branch, to us, and we've been running the Lake Whatcom Railway since. First passenger train was June 3rd of 1972. They had to go through a whole bunch of stuff like getting ICC permission to discontinue service on it and all that kind of thing, and that seemed to have taken about a year and a half. Another problem was that they wanted to use our 4-mile Lake Whatcom Railway for access to a track that they were going to remove west of here. They were selling the 4 miles of track, or 4 miles of land west of Blue Canyon to the Whatcom County Park Department, or Whatcom County for the Park Department, and they needed a way of getting that track material. They were removing the track themselves, and what they would do is have a crane and a flat car and bring the stuff into Park, or siding up at Park, and load stuff onto their gondola cars and whatever right there. And then I think in February of 1972, the last train of theirs came up to pick up their track materials and so forth. Now this is interesting because they didn't want to sell it to us until they were sure that they were finished, because they didn't want the complication of we running a train one direction and they coming around the curve coming the other direction with something. So they wanted to have the dispatching authority until they knew that they were finished. Well, it turned out that we actually bought it in January of 1972, and their last train was February of 1972, so their actual last trains on here were about a month after we actually owned it. Bob Barr was a reporter for the Seattle Times, and he and there were a few others. That Greg Gilbert was a photographer, and they would write stories for us. The day, June 3rd, I mentioned, was our day that we started. And the night before, this was before they really had color except for the comics in the Sunday newspaper. Everything was black and white. But Bob Barr and Greg Gilbert somehow arranged to the front page of the Friday Seattle Times, Friday evening paper, had a front page picture of 1070, our steam engine, crossing the bridge up at Blue Canyon. Bob Barr and Greg Gilbert had come up maybe 2 or 3 days before. The train came up here on the Memorial Day weekend, which is a weekend before June 3rd. That shows how close we were. And then 2 days later, the Seattle Times people wanted us to put the two cars together, run a picture so they could get some pictures. So it appeared in the Seattle Times on the front page on that June 2nd, 1972 newspaper. And Bob Barr wasn't quite accurate. He said we were going to run on both Saturday and Sunday. Well, we were only going to run on Saturday, but 400 people showed up to ride on Sunday, so we ran both Saturday and Sunday. Then the following year, Greg Gilbert, I think, and I'm not sure who did the story, put it in the cover of the pictorial of the Seattle Times in 1973. And then King TV came up there. I think there was a guy named reporter named Al Wallace, and I don't know who the photographer was, and took some pictures there. And other times, Cairo TV and Seattle KARO and KOMO have come up too to do stories about the train. And then we had a boy here. He was only about 11 or 12 years old, named Tim Bowman, and he was kind of in that one day, a rainy day. It was just a terrible January day, and he was sitting probably in this room where I was, or the room right next to it, in this business car. And he decided, oh, there's a typewriter here. I'm going to write to KOMO and say, will you put us on Kids World? And sure enough, KOMO came up, and Tim Bowman was the reporter, and his little cousin Troy was doing something with a coffee shop car, and Tim Bowman and KOMO got it not all over the United States. My uncle in Louisville, Kentucky saw it on television there. A person that worked here was in Argentina, maybe 10 some years later, saw it on television in Argentina, Tim Bowman's program about Kids World and this Lake Whatcom Railway. So we've gotten around a little bit.
I heard the rumble, looked out, here's where I lost.